Thank you so much for such a warm welcome. Very happy to be here. And all right, so we are going to spend the next roughly an hour diving into a new era of Uranus in Gemini. So I'm just going to put up this slideshow. And we're going to talk about Uranus in Gemini from the perspective of the trickster. And we're going to get into why that is, when that is in history, etc. So this talk is in 3 parts, and we're going to start with part 1. So Uranus in Gemini. Gemini is a sign that asks questions. So I'd like you to just take a moment before we dive into a lot of information, also a Gemini theme, to kind of check in with yourself and think about, what do you already know about Uranus and Gemini, if anything? But I would guess that most folks who have shown up today or will watch this recording later already know something about Uranus and Gemini. And then my next question to you is, what are you curious about? What do you want to know? And before we started the recording of this talk, we were discussing questions about Uranus and Gemini that we all had. And I know I have lots of questions. and this talk came out of a desire to start diving into those and getting some answers. So one thing that I've been noticing as we have been approaching this era, approaching this shift, the transition from Uranus and Taurus to Uranus and Gemini, is that there's been a lot of sort of fear-based historical narratives going around. There is a template set in history that wars have broken out when Uranus has gone into Gemini. And we are, yes, being realistic, being practical, we are seeing that similar theme arising in this present moment in time. But one of my questions is this the whole story? There's been wars without Uranus and Gemini as well. So what is the rest of the story of a Uranus and Gemini cycle? And one thing about history, and when I talk about history, I'm talking about recorded history, because there's plenty of history that's gone by that was not recorded. There's, oral histories, there's storytelling, there's myth. But looking just at recorded history for the sake of simplicity in this talk, one of my biggest questions going into this is, what can be learned from history that can help us in this current cycle? So we're going to be, taking a little trip into the past right now, and hoping that as we move through that, we'll gain some answers about our present time and the future. But one thing we know about Uranus in particular, and I would say Gemini as well, is that it's going to be unpredictable. We're not really going to be exactly able to predict what's going to happen during this timeline. Okay, so as I was researching for this talk, there were several themes that arose about Uranus and Gemini throughout history. And I went back, several centuries and looked at themes that seem to repeat again and again. And these themes have to do with communication and education, technological shifts, conflicting or diverse ideas, thoughts, and beliefs, and changes around trade and finance. So these is just 3 examples, among many, to kind of ground us in examples from time. And one of the first was in 1022, which is the first recorded burning for hearsay in France. So again, we have this diverse ideas, diverse beliefs, people seeing things from opposing perspectives, opposing viewpoints. In 1440, the printing press was invented, and that kicked off the printing revolution. And then in the 1770s, as many of us are aware of, it was known as the Age of Revolution. Mostly, as far as I could, from my research, in Europe and the Americas, in Western culture. And I'm sure there were other examples in other parts of the world as well, but those aren't as well documented as far as I could come up with. So this talk, I'm American, I'm from the United States, as embarrassed as I am at this moment, but I wanted to just explain why this is United States focused, because I know we have people joining us from all over the world, and I didn't want to just be, typical American. Of course, the America is the focus of attention. But besides the fact that this is the history that I have most experience with, one thing about the United States that stands out in relationship to the Uranus and Gemini cycle, that of 4 countries that are currently still in existence, the United States is the only one that's having its third Uranus return. So other countries that are having their Uranus return right now are Israel, Lebanon, and I believe Japan. But those 3 countries, they were the charts for them were set for the 1940s, right at World War II. So the United States has a chart that we still use that shows that we're headed towards our third Uranus return, which will be next year in 2027. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Okay, so talked about that a little bit. Italy, Israel, Lebanon, and I thought Japan, but I could be wrong about that. But again, all of these came out in that post or during World War II. And you'll note that a number of those countries are in the news right now as well. Their return, Lebanon's having its return pretty much around the same time as the United States. Israel and Italy, going to be a little bit later, more towards 2028, 2029. So stay tuned for those. Okay, the other reason is that the American Revolution of 1776 sparked other revolutions and introduced that age of revolutions that I mentioned a little earlier in countries like France, Poland, Ireland, Spanish, and then there were smaller revolutions in Switzerland, Russia, and Brazil. And I didn't know about that Brazil one before I dived into this. Okay, so why Uranus and Gemini and the trickster archetype? To some of you, this might be very obvious, but for those of you who may not be as familiar with the symbology and the themes of Uranus and Gemini, I want to make a really strong case for why I'm diving into the trickster as an archetype for understanding this next era. So we're going to look at this from the perspective of Uranus, as Uranus shows up in myth, particularly the Greek myths, because we draw a lot on the Greek mythology to kind of ground our understanding of the Western astrology. And the Greek, of course, came from Babylonia, current day Iran, traveling through some other cultures along the way. But the Greek stories are kind of what we still have that help create clues about understanding the planet. I want to stress that the Greek mythology and the stories of Uranus that show up there, or any of the planets really, that's not the whole story. There are differences between the stories and the way that we understand a planet astrologically, but the myths do give us information. So Uranus is an interesting planet because it's a little more, how do we say it? A little more kind of primal nature energy than some of the planets like the moon, or Venus or Mars, which we have more of a kind of relationship with. It's almost like a human god goddess form. But Uranus is one of the forces of nature planet, and Uranus was known as the sky god and the rainmaker. The definition of the word Uranus in many ancient languages is rainmaker or lord of rain. And this is interesting because sometimes we think of Uranus as more of an airy mental planet, but there is this sense of creating water. And when we think about the modern rulership, the relationship between Aquarius and Uranus, Aquarius is the water bearer, the holder of water, and Uranus is the rainmaker, the water giver. So there's some interesting connections there. So also in myth, this is a quote from Hesiod: Gaia first bore starry heaven, Uranus, equal to herself, to cover her on every side, and to be an ever sure abiding place for the blessed gods. So we get this sense of Uranus as sort of a container or a protector of the gods, a place to kind of match the earth, earth and sky, this very primal relationship between earth and sky. So in some stories, Uranus was spontaneously born of the earth goddess Gaia, the first goddess, also a primal nature goddess. But in other stories, Uranus was also her husband, and in some stories is both. So some of the stories say that Uranus was equal to Gaia and was born out of the chaos of creation rather than being born out of the earth goddess. So there's these different perspectives that we sense with the origin story of Uranus. So after Uranus was born and after he had offspring, children with Gaia, his children, the Titans, they revolted against him because he wanted to hide them. He did hide them in Gaia's body for fear that they would kill him, and they did. He was castrated by his son Kronos as a result of hiding them as revenge, and during that Titan revolt. And Venus was born from the fluids that came from his genitals, which were thrown into the sea. Quite a gory, violent birth and, family story. It's very, very kind of soap opera, dramatic. And again, this is a mythical story, so we interpret it almost like a dream. It's not necessarily literal. How do we work with the symbols and translate them into human mortal meaning? All right, I also want to look at Uranus in astronomy because this gives us another perspective on Uranus. And when we're looking at Uranus and Gemini, we want to look at multiple perspectives. So Uranus and Gemini, in astronomy, Uranus is the first planet past Saturn. So for those of you who are familiar with Chiron lies in that orbit between Saturn and Uranus, and there's a lot of really great meaning in that placement of Chiron between Saturn and Uranus. So Uranus has an axis tilt, which is on its side, which is unique from the other planets, and it has one of the lowest temperatures of all the planets. So just kind of adding that into this cauldron of making meaning of Uranus. And let's just do kind of a check with ourselves for a moment. And I'm sure many of you have already done this, but let's take just a moment in the middle of this talk to, put your chart in your mind and take note of where is 0 degrees of Gemini in your own natal chart. Which house is it in? Are there any planets that are aspected or will be aspected? Are there any angles or points, like the nodes, for example, maybe some asteroids that you relate with? Where is Uranus hanging out right now by transit in your chart? And kind of adding that into this making meaning process, given what we've covered so far. All right, so how do we see Uranus in astrology? There's definitely the kind of translation of the myths that show up in our understanding of Uranus in astrology. There's some input from the astronomy that we see with Uranus in astrology, but these are some key words that most astrologers would relate to when they're describing how Uranus shows up in the chart, whether it be a natal chart or mundane chart or a chart of a country. These are some words. We've got a rule breaker, a rebel. There's chaos, lightning bolts, electricity, sudden change, surprise, shock, trauma, the truth teller, innovator, technology, eccentric, and outside societal norms. So we're going to be returning to these keywords as we take a look a little further on at some key charts of Uranian characters in history. The cycle of Uranus. Uranus takes 84 years to make a full cycle through all the signs. So 84 years ago, Uranus was in Gemini. And 84 years before that, Uranus was also in Gemini. Uranus spends 7.5 years in each zodiac sign. So 7.5 years ago, Uranus entered Taurus. And then yesterday, last night, Uranus entered Gemini. It did enter it last fall for a few months, but now it's going to be hanging out in Gemini for the next 7.5 years. So wherever Uranus is in your natal chart, this is a place where you like to stir things up, where you innovate, you awaken. This is your most authentic, truth-telling, free place. It's where you fly your freak flag high. And by transit, wherever Uranus is moving in relationship to your natal chart, this shows where old structures are ready to explode, lightning style. When lightning strikes, it illuminates. It may destroy what it's striking, but we get to see what needs to go very clearly. And thinking of that lightning flash, it's very bright, it's a very particular kind of light. So this catalyzes awakening to the truth, and it facilitates greater authenticity, greater freedom. So an interesting piece about Uranus in Gemini that's different than Uranus in any other sign is that Uranus is what's known as the higher octave of Mercury. Every planet, well, actually, I shouldn't say every planet, but a number of planets have a higher octave planet. At Venus, higher octave is Neptune. Mercury's higher octave is Uranus. And so this is kind of a funny astrological puzzle because Uranus is in a sign whose ruler, Mercury, is the lower octave of it. So it's a puzzle to kind of make some sense of over the next 7.5 years. What is the meaning of this? There's definitely a affinity between Uranus, which does have that airy feeling, in Gemini, an air sign. So let's take a look at some Gemini themes. Gemini's planetary ruler is the planet Mercury, and Mercury is the only god who could move between all the worlds, the world of the gods, the mortal world, and the underworld. One of the most known mythical stories about Mercury is Mercury's birth story, which is right after Mercury was born, the newborn, he caught sight of Apollo's cattle, Apollo the sun god, and decided to steal them. And long story short, the part of the motivation for stealing them was because he wanted to create a musical instrument. And I can't remember all the details, but somehow stealing the cattle was going to facilitate making this instrument. And Mercury is related to music and other ways of communicating besides just verbal communication. So we can see right away Mercury had this impulse to create and to communicate and also to steal. So Mercury definitely has a thief kind of archetype under its umbrella. So some of the keywords or the archetypes for Gemini: a thief, witty, quick, silver tongue, mercurial, shape-shifting, boundary-defying, pollinator, questioning, learning, information broker. Gemini is a mutable air sign, and we can translate that into meaning mental movement. So some of the jobs or personas that go with Gemini: journalist, teacher, gossip columnist, nosy and or friendly neighbor, chatty Cathy, social media influencer, photojournalist, and writer. Okay, so why Uranus and Gemini as the trickster? Let's look at the connections. So when we put those all together, kind of Mad Lib style, we have, a lot of overlap. And we've got this very active, rule-breaking, boundary-defying, shape-shifting pollinator who can bring chaos in the pursuit of speed and information and learning. And there's a lot of overlap here with each of these different planet signs and archetypes. So how do we honor the trickster? When we enter into a new era, when an outer planet like Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto changes sign, because each of those planets stays for so long in a sign, we really go deep with whatever sign it is in. And it can be helpful, I found, being an astrologer, to really relate to the planets and their movement as living beings. So as living energies that we have a very essential kind of primal relationship with. So some of you might be familiar with animism, but everything is alive, everything has a spirit or a soul. So how do we honor the trickster archetype and welcome it in? Because when we ignore or insult the trickster, that's when things tend to get ugly. So recognition and respect. We want to pay attention that the trickster is going to be very alive over this next 7.5-year period, and respect the power of the trickster. So who are tricksters? They're hard, the part of the nature of the trickster is they're hard to see. They're hard to fully recognize. So in the mythical stories of tricksters, they're often talking animals or creatures from other worlds: fairies, elves, dwarves, etc. When we see one of these show up in a story, it's a sign that the trickster has arrived and that things are going to get interesting. So here's some examples of trickster tales from different cultures and different eras. Some of these are very, very old or have roots in older stories. Brer Rabbit is one that many of us in America are familiar with. And although this story showed up for the first time somewhere in the 19th century, it actually originates from older African stories that feature hares as tricksters and shapeshifters. And then we've got ravens from the Pacific Northwest tribes, spiders, also African American stories. Anansi the spider is one. Foxes show up a lot in European stories. And then, of course, coyotes. That the region that I currently live in, show up a lot, especially in Diné Navajo stories. Okay, so going back, ×3, right? 3 is a magical number. And we're talking some magic here. Gemini and Mercury are also the sign of, or the planet, the archetype of the magician. So if we go back 3 eras in history from this current one, we're looking at the Revolutionary War period. And, for those of you who know American history, this was 1774 to 1782. Other planetary conditions, planetary weather at that time was that Neptune was in Virgo, different from now when Neptune is in Aries. But Pluto was also kind of on that edge between Pluto and Capricorn and Aquarius. So that's some overlap between this current time. On June 15th, 1776, right before the Declaration of Independence was signed, a few weeks, we had Mars conjunct Uranus at 7 degrees of Gemini. So we're going to see that again coming, I believe it's this June, maybe it's July, somewhere this summer. Somebody can add that one into the chat. But the historical gift of this time, and yes, there bad things happened. It was a war. There's a lot of violence, a lot of death, a lot of loss, a lot of grief. It was a hard time. And so I don't want to be a Pollyanna and just, be like, no, look at the positive. But I do want to acknowledge that a gift did emerge from this time. And one of the gifts, and it's interesting because we're seeing some really obvious clues as Uranus just moved into Gemini last night about freedom of the press. But freedom of the press evolved at this time and became the basis for the First Amendment to the Constitution. The freedom of the press is one of the greatest bulwarks of liberty and can never be restrained but by despotic governments. So this is from the Virginia Colonial Legislature Declaration of Rights. So here's our character, our person who was born into this era, Johnny Appleseed. So he was born in 1774, pretty much in the middle of that Revolutionary War period. And, every person born, every chart is a snapshot of that moment. And they carry that moment through their lifetime, and that helps shape history. So he was one of the gifts of that era. And some of the Uranus and Gemini qualities that he reflects that we've looked at as we were looking at some of these themes and keywords, he had a wit, a quickness, he was a pollinator, he was also an outlaw, he didn't live by societal norms, and he was known as a great storyteller. So I just want to read this quote that I found that I really love because it's so Uranus and Gemini. He was a small, chunked man, quick and restless in his motions and conversation. His beard, though not long, was unshaven, and his hair was long and dark, and his eye black and sparkling. He lived the roughest life and often slept in the woods. His clothing was mostly old, being generally given to him in exchange for apple trees. He went barefooted and often traveled miles through the snow in that way. He wore on his head a tin utensil which answered both as a cap and a mushpot. So quite an eccentric character. And this is a reflection from a child who knew Johnny Appleseed. We can hear him read now just as he did that summer day. His was a strange eloquence at times. And I just want to capture that phrase. What better translation of Uranus and Gemini? Uranus, strange, eloquent Gemini. And he was undoubtedly a man of genius. So here's his chart. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it just because of we have, a short amount of time. I've got more material to get through, but I do want to just showcase, we don't know the exact time he was born. I can't remember why I chose that Sagittarius rising, but we're going to ignore the rising sign and the house placement for a moment and just take a look at that. Not only did he have Uranus in Gemini, but he also had the moon in Gemini and Uranus squaring Venus, a little bit loose, but that's still a square. And this Mercury Sun conjunction trining natal Uranus. So a very interesting chart for the person that we know of as Johnny Appleseed. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the story of Johnny Appleseed, he traveled all around America planting apple seeds that grew into apple trees. And they weren't necessarily to eat, although I'm sure people did end up eating them, but they were to make cider. And he's sometimes known as the American Dionysus, which I find very interesting, especially looking at his chart. Okay, so we're going to fast forward um, to the next Uranus and Gemini cycle, which took place during another very tragic, violent, and, shadowy time in American history, which was the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Again, like this current era, there's some overlap with the other planets. Neptune was also in Aries during this time, but Pluto was in Taurus. So there's similarities, but differences. War broke out on April 12th, 1861, when Mars in Gemini again was conjunct Uranus. So we're seeing this repeat. History does not repeat, but it does rhyme. Definitely, Mark Twain. That is the most repeated quote in astrological, I don't know, explanation that I can think of. It's a great quote. So again, there was a gift at this time, and this was the push for literacy, noting that, that Gemini theme for African Americans, which was really kind of held or driven by the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, and that was March 3rd, 1865, right as the war was ending. So our trickster of the era, the gift that was born during that time frame. Many of you may have heard of her, even maybe you went to a school called Ida B. Wells, because many schools are named after her. And noting again that Gemini theme of education, especially elementary school education, is one of the Gemini themes. So she also was a rule breaker, an innovator, a genius, an educator, and an activist. One of the things she was most known for is for pursuing justice for African Americans who were lynched. That was one of the kind of linchpins of her platform, but she did many, many other amazing things. Definitely somebody who was just a trailblazer. So here's some great quotes. You may have heard these quotes, but not known that Ida B. Wells said them. I would say that was true for me. I was like, oh, that's who said that. Nice. Wanted better die fighting against injustice than die like a dog or a rat in a trap. Now that is straight and to the point. No holds barred, right? The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. So I love these quotes for Uranus and Gemini and for this amazing human being. And look how beautiful she was. Okay, so this is her natal chart. Again, the birth time, don't know. But let's look at the planetary makeup. Okay, so I was not surprised. I was really loving astrology when I saw her moon, Neptune, Mars stellium in Aries. Wow, right? The quotes just encapsulate this placement of her chart so beautifully. Looking to the Uranus placements, Venus conjunct Uranus in Gemini, amazing. A loose conjunction to her south node, but yes, she's got this really heartfelt, caring, protective, imaginative Sun in Cancer, Mercury in Cancer. She cared about her people. She spoke for her people. She articulated for her people. And she just was like, mama bear. A really amazing person. Okay, moving along though, because we've got more historical ground to cover. The next Uranus and Gemini cycle before this one, World War II. Now, this is I just want to say that this one is interesting because Neptune was in Libra then, Pluto was in Leo. So there was not a whole lot of overlap between the other planets and this current period. I do want to note, though, again, this Mars conjunct, that should be Mars in Gemini conjunct Uranus in Gemini by 1 degree, very, very close. And this is, that date is when Italy surrendered to the Allied forces after more than 3 years as a member of the Alliance of the Axis powers. And again, noting that Italy is one of those planets that's up for its Uranus return. So, interesting synchronicity. Last night, I had the honor of hosting my 100-year-old grandma, who came all the way from California to visit me here in New Mexico. And she often has told me the story of how she was a Rosie the Riveter. And she told me that story again last night. She said, I didn't like that job much, but but it was a historical moment in history, the Rosie the Riveter era, and it laid the groundwork for the women's movement because during that time when the men went away to the war and they needed to keep the industrial, jobs going in order to keep the war going, they brought women in, and the women were able to prove that they could do the jobs that were in traditionally male industries. So that was a funny kind of connection point with having my grandma Rosie the Riveter last night here. Okay, so our trickster of the era, born in January 26, 1944, Angela Davis. She, for those of you who are familiar with her story, it's quite a story. And I got a picture of her here when she was young in the 60s, and current day Angela Davis. What a powerful woman. She also shares those qualities of our other two tricksters representing their era as an outlaw, an activist, an educator, a writer. She defied societal norms and she awakened the collective to some realities that maybe we didn't want to look at, but we needed to. And this is her great quote. I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. I love the kind of play with the words here, the intelligence that she's showing with that Uranus and Gemini archetype. It's just a perfect Uranus and Gemini quote. And here is her chart. And we're going to zoom in again to the Gemini placements and note that she had a very tight conjunction of Mars to Uranus in Gemini, about 2 degrees, and it's right around those early degrees of Gemini that show up again and again in American history as being a very kind of lightning rod, Uranian theme there. Time period when Mars conjuncts Uranus and Uranus has just moved into Gemini. She embodied this. She is a living embodiment of one of these powerful moments. And I got to tell you, I'm going to be watching the news for, signs of Angela Davis over this next couple of years in particular, as Uranus, she has her Uranus return. She's about 82 now. And then you're short from what is she going to be saying? Is she going to be that? What's she going to be doing? And you also know that Uranus-Mars conjunction is making a pretty close trine to both her Sun and her South Node in Aquarius. Super interesting stuff there. Okay, so we are going to start to wrap up so I can leave time for a little bit of questions. And I'd just like to offer a moment for reflection in our kind of speedy time travel through history and taking a look at just some of those characters that represented each of those different eras. Whose story did you most relate to? Who captivated your interest? And whose story seemed foreign or a little uncomfortable? And then, do you have any takeaways from these trickster personalities? What does it mean that they were born during these times and that they developed into the people that they came to be? What does it reflect in that collective kind of time frame that these people had the stories that they did to share through their lives. And one of the main things, that I want to highlight overall with this talk and this, we're on that precipice of Uranus and Gemini beginning, is just to look for those gifts that emerge during this time. Look for those personalities who are born and how they grow. Because we, as Mr. Rogers said, when times are tough, look for the helpers, right? So who are the trickster helpers that are going to be emerging now? And what are the initiatives, like the Freedmen's Bureau, like freedom of the press, that can come out at this time? So one of the strongest themes, I won't say strongest, but strong themes, shall we say, of Uranus and Gemini is that perspectives can change, perspective can shift. We can look at things from down below or way up high or left or right if we are getting fixated from one point of view. Uranus and Gemini gives us the power to change our mind. And that's a very powerful kind of initiative to look for as we embark on this Uranus and Gemini era. And I think that, yeah. So I'm going to close this down and see if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Fern. That was a wonderful talk, and the depth and breadth of exploring the way that the tricksters arose during the Uranus and Gemini time and moved forward society by creating cultural conversation and transformations. Absolutely amazing. And it gives one a lot of hope, because we seem to be going into a challenging time, and to have hope that out of that comes newer and better societies from the work of individuals gifted with Uranus and Gemini. Thank you so much for that presentation. We do have a couple questions if you're open to them. The first one is from Amir Bey. He says, I noticed that many of the rank and file of the Black Panther Party had Uranus and Gemini, and many activists. I think that Uranus and Gemini, and Uranus in general help to define generations better than Generation Z. What do you think about Uranus as being a generational marker?
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't looked at a lot of the Black Panther Party charts, but that makes perfect sense to me. Actually, my mentor for astrology and herbs, who I met when I was in college in my early 20s, and when she was young, she was part of the Black Panthers, and she moved, from Philadelphia to Oakland, she really taught me a lot about that era and those people and gave me a very, Uranus and Gemini different perspective on it that was extremely valuable for my growth as a person. So I 100% think Uranus and Gemini is going to be a very crucial time for shaping our cultural narrative and the people that emerge from that. They're going to be people to watch. Yeah.
Beautiful. Another question that arises in my mind is Richard Tarnas talks about Uranus as being Prometheus as an archetype. How do you feel about that? And what do you think about that in the context of your studies?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one because um, Prometheus kind of sacrificed himself for humans, right? He I don't remember all the details of the story, but Prometheus was a human ally, a mortal ally, and he suffered for it. And I'm not sure I see Uranus as being as accessible, I guess, to humans in that way. To me, I resonate more with Uranus as that primal force of nature, that it doesn't really care too much about our personal stories. It's here to bring awakening and change. So, um, Yeah, but it's all kind of developing myths, and we'll probably get a lot more information about Uranus as we go through this cycle of Uranus and Gemini. More stories, more news stories, I would think. Yeah.
Fantastic. So we have Audrea Gebhardt, and she says the baby boomers have Uranus and Gemini. These people who will all be turning 85, they're going to be having their Uranus return. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's the thing with, like looking at Angela Davis's chart and
Mm,
just looking at the baby boomer generation. They also have that Pluto and Leo, and there's that sextile between Uranus and Leo. Um, and they, of course, are known for that Vietnam War era, for civil rights, the women's movement. There was a lot of change of the culture that came in that time. And so I also wonder, I have the same question. Are they going to like rise again, during this time? Is there going to be like a last kind of fight before they go? And I hope so. The Uranus and Gemini, Pluto and Leo baby boomer, most of them generation have an ability to articulate
mm,
so with such creativity and flair, and so I see somebody in the chat said a large portion of Uranus in Cancer. So there is some kind of on the edge with that generation. But those who have Uranus and Gemini and Pluto and Leo, the sheer creativity and brilliance that came out of that generation is going to be really interesting to see as they're on the out, leaving the Earth plane and headed towards other terrain, how they're going to go. I hope they go out with a bang. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, fantastic. Really interesting how last night there was a shocking press event as Uranus entered Gemini, and you really pointed out how Uranus and Gemini has a lot to do with journalism and the ability to investigate freely what is going on in the world around you. Do you see that theme like growing and being highlighted, and how do you see that interacting with AI, which is also something that's on everybody's consciousness, so to speak, these days?
Yeah, I have something to say about that one. One thing I have to say is that we cannot forget the shadow side of Uranus and Gemini.
Mm,
And I see that whole concept of thievery, trickery, stealing as being
mm,
a very big thing. Did we see what we thought we see? Are they telling the truth? That's
mm.
really gonna be, I think, something we're all going to be looking at. We already are, but more. With AI, I've seen so many astrologers point to AI as being connected to Uranus and Gemini. I see why. That makes sense. But my question again, and I'm all about the questions, right? Um, are Uranus always brings surprises. AI really wasn't that big of a surprise. So I think there's going to be new technology emerging that we haven't even conceptualized yet that really will be a surprise. AI, in some ways, was pretty predictable. So it doesn't really, to me, fit under that umbrella of Uranus and Gemini in that way. So we'll see what happens. I'm not the kind of astrologer that makes these hard and fixed predictions. I've got Mars in my third house, so I'm much more of a questioning, let's explore it, let's investigate it endlessly kind of astrologer. So yeah, that's my long-winded
Mm.
Sagittarius in the third house answer to that question.
Hey, that's brilliant, and that seems very appropriate for Uranus and Gemini. Like, let's look at the questions. Let's look at both sides of the questions. Let's like really suss out the dynamic of the conversation there. We do have another question. Amir Bey says Uranus has transitioned to Gemini in Trump's 10th house. What do you think about that for the president?
Yeah. Well, haven't we all been watching and waiting, for that moment to happen? disappointed, disappointed. Well, what I was really been looking at is this final pass of Uranus and Taurus squaring his ascendant, um, and making that 29 degree to 29 degree fixed sign thing happen. Yeah, there was an event. We still haven't completely digested, processed, or understood that event. Uranus moving into Gemini in the 10th house. I could tell you what I hope for. I don't know if that's going to correspond with the actual manifestation of it, but maybe there's greater awareness of him carrying that archetype of Uranus and Gemini and really being seen for it, of that it's like that lightning bolt that hits and it's like, whoa, what are we doing with this person? Okay, so I'm getting a little political and I know we're not supposed to do that, but
Mm.
that that's my answer. I'll stop there.
Yeah, great. And I think you did really well there, just being like very open with what's happening here. Let's see. Pamela Joy also asked a question in the side chat. She says, affirming shift towards higher consciousness as Uranus transits through Gemini, as Pluto transits through Aquarius. Her concern being we are technologically advancing beyond our psychological spiritual growth right now. And that's a really interesting thing to contemplate. And one can go back to you said that the printing press was invented with Uranus and Gemini, or came out into population with Uranus and Gemini. And one of the effects of the printing press was that people lost their mind because suddenly everybody could read. Just like right now, everybody can say anything on social media, and people lost context with what was true or not during that time because before then all of Western European society had been relating to what was true was what the church printed. And then suddenly that opened up. And I think that's kind of what Pamela's talking about. Like there's this new technology, it's opening up and going past what people may be psychologically and spiritually ready for. How do you think that works out?
Well, just as hearing the question, hearing your reflections on it, what comes to mind is the Wild West. I live in the
Mm,
Wild West. I still actually retains that feeling. And the Wild West is, historically speaking, is a dangerous, scary, but very exciting and innovative place where people have an opportunity to reinvent themselves. And I think that's kind of where we're headed with information, with ideas, with perspectives, with what we thought we knew, and what we don't know. There's so much that I think we're going to be discovering that we do not know, new truth,
mhm.
you know. So it's going to be a great experiment, and humans are pretty resilient. So I think we're going to survive the experiment.
Yeah, fantastic. Let's hope so. I love that positive note. Uh, just one other question. This is something that I think about a little bit. I hope everybody is okay indulging it. So you pointed out that Uranus and Gemini is a trickster. There's a fairy energy, there's a spirit energy, there's an elf energy. Sometimes it seems like extraterrestrials fall into that category. And, there seems to be a lot of that in the news these days. Do you have any reflections or thoughts on that?
I think that's so on point. Yes, there. it- mm, I come from a pagan tradition, and so I resonate much more with the elf fairy genre. And I also think there's overlap between
Mm,
extraterrestrial theme and the shining ones. That's what the Celts used to call the fairies, the shining ones. Well,
beautiful.
that's really an interesting synchronicity there when we think about what we think we know about extraterrestrials. So yes, that emerging consciousness, more and more information, more in the news, all of it is really resonant with this time.
Absolutely. So we have a couple comments by Audrea Gebhardt, and they're not really formed in the question, but they're in the Q&A, so I'm going to just read them aloud because they didn't make it into the chat. Adria Gebhardt says the early Uranus and Gemini people who also have it trining their natal Neptune and Libra are good problem solvers, mechanics, they're creative. And Adria sees them as things, seeing things differently than how they mentally approach things. They see things differently, they approach things differently. And that is part of what Adria recognizes as a quality of Uranus and Gemini people. Do you have any thoughts?
I agree,
Yeah.
I agree. I think if you've ever spent time with somebody with a lot of Gemini planet, they're
Mm.
so like exciting. There's a lot of movement, there's a lot of activity, there's over here, over there, and you're following them around, and it's quite a ride. So yeah, I think this is going to be for folks who have a lot of fire, water and earth. They're going to have to do some nervous system healing, right? They're going to have to stay with themselves because this is a fast-paced ride. Air and fire also is going to have to do that because they're like ready to go. Uh,
Mhm.
it's a real shift in energetics with this elemental transition this year, all the way around.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're at the time. It's 11 o'clock. And thank you. Oh, one more quick question came in. Marie Claire, what about the pure side? I think that's pure. It reads as puer, which is a type of tea, but I think it's pure side of Gemini. The difficulty or the um, refusal to grow up. How is Uranus and Gemini affect that?
Ooh, I love that.
Yeah,
Well,
that's deep.
I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but um, what the first thing that comes to mind is I wonder if there's going to be like a revision of the Peter Pan story, like new movies, new takes.
Mm.
Yes, I think that archetype is going to be a really interesting one to track during this time frame, and maybe we'll see some upgrades, some shifts, some changes, some new understandings. So, yeah, fabulous.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, let's see. I think that is everybody. And if there's any last questions, this is your moment, people. But other than that, Fern, it has been so great having you on OPA. Thank you very much. The Mercury Hour has been incredibly enriched this month by your presence and your brilliance and your Uranian insight into Uranus and Gemini by asking questions that we can all go and ponder and then, leave as open explorations that we get to, enrich and experience through the next 7 years, 7.5 years. Thank you so much, Fern. And thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for showing up and listening today, for taking time out of your busy lives to come and receive a wisdom astrology transmission from Fern Vuchinich. Again, Fern, you're hosting a class coming up. Could you please just mention what that is briefly and then tell us how people can find you?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Georgie. Yeah, so I've got a class coming up starting May 16th in collaboration with Radiant Astrology, Christina Cadill, and it's called Activating a New Reality with Astrology. And basically, we're going to be covering the shift from earth and water to fire and air and all those
Mm.
planetary transitions and just grounding it in the natal chart and your natal chart, exploring that and working with tools and practices to navigate this very alive and historical moment that we're in 2026. So thank you so much. I so appreciated the opportunity to do this. It was really fun.
Thank you and goodbye, everybody. Hope to see you next month.
Thank you. Bye-bye.